Welcome back to Face the Nation. Hundreds of Russian missiles have rained down on Ukrainian territory over the past week, most of them aimed at civilian targets. CBS News senior foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata is in Dnipro, Ukraine, with more.
Days after unleashing the heaviest bombardment that Ukraine has seen since the invasion began, striking a dozen cities across the country in a coordinated series of rocket and long-range missile attacks. Russian President Vladimir Putin said there is no need for more massive strikes for now. At a news conference in Kazakhstan, he said he had no regrets and that Russia is doing everything right. The merciless battering of civilians in frontline cities like Zaporizhia tell a different story. Residents told us a missile slammed into this neighborhood at around 2 in the morning. The missile punched a hole right through this apartment block, causing it to collapse on those inside, tearing apart not just homes, but lives. The blast scattered children's clothes among the trees. At one point, the heavy machinery clearing the rubble stopped. A drone hovered overhead as rescuers worked by hand. And another body was lifted from beneath the debris. Investigators worked to put a name to another victim of Putin's war. Serhiy Nikinorov lives in the adjacent apartment and escaped serious injury, but he's so shell-shocked he can hardly speak. My very close friends live there on the first floor, he said. I lost friends on the second floor, too. And yet, despite Russia's onslaught, troops have lost ground to Ukrainian forces on the battlefield, where the counteroffensive has advanced south at such a rate the Kremlin installed authorities in the city of Kherson and urged residents to evacuate to parts of Russia. In his address last night, President Zelensky switched from Ukrainian to Russian, saying, as for the citizens of Russia who do not want to participate in this criminal war, who surrender to Ukrainian captivity, will save their lives. We visited some of the dozens of those recently liberated villages. The high school that served as a Russian military HQ bears the scars of the battle to wrestle it back. Down the road, we found Oksana, still reeling. What did you think when you first saw Ukrainian soldiers here? Happiness. She said, I was just very happy. In tears, she described the terror under Russian occupation, saying, we were all suffering. It was so hard and so scary. Now, free from Russian military rule for the first time in months. The next day, following that huge barrage, President Zelensky pleaded with leaders of the G7, specifically the United States, for more air defense systems. And while there has been a pledge by the White House for more advanced weapons, they can't get here quickly enough. Margaret?
Charlie D'Agata, thank you. And we are joined now by Ukraine's ambassador to the United States, Oksana Markarova. Madam Ambassador, good to have you back. Let's pick up where my colleague just left off. Last time President Zelensky was on this program at the end of September, he talked specifically about the delivery of air defense systems, thanking the United States, but they still have not been delivered. What is the holdup in the delivery of American weapons?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for talking about that. Yes, we still need all the weapons we're talking about, with air defense being a priority after these horrible strikes that we've all seen returning not only to select cities, but everywhere in Ukraine, and especially in Kyiv and infrastructure before the winter. Unfortunately, these systems are difficult to produce, and they're not ready on the shelves waiting, but we're doing everything possible and asking our partners to do everything possible to speed up not only the delivery, but also the ordering of the system. So hopefully, you heard your president been very clear on trying to accelerate the delivery of those, and we are counting on more systems to be announced and decisions taken to produce, because we do need to secure as many places in Ukraine as possible, as many children in Ukraine as possible from Russian rockets.
The Pentagon has said it's still about a month before those NASAMS come. Let's talk about what we just heard on Friday from Russian President Vladimir Putin. He said that the mobilization drive to increase the number of soldiers will end in the next 2 weeks, and that massive strikes are no longer needed. what does your government assess he means by this? What are you preparing for?
Well, as we said, 235 days, no limits and no moral restrictions from Russian aggressor. So we should be prepared for everything. And it's actually irrelevant at this point what he says, because this partial mobilization has been a big failure. People in Russia do not want to be mobilized. They're not equipped, they're not prepared, they're not motivated. Yes, there are a lot of them, but it has been a failure in Russia. They're probably not forcing it because they will have the planned mobilization in the autumn. We don't know. Mm-hmm. All we are focused on in staying the course and defending our country everywhere and being prepared for anything that can come from the Russian Federation. We have seen all the war crimes, we have seen all the rocket attacks, we have seen them using these Iranian Shahed drones on civilian residential areas, killing families. So what he says is actually irrelevant, because what they do, and everyone see what they do, this is what we have to pay attention to.
I want to ask you about billionaire Elon Musk. He seemed to have reversed his position yesterday, at least publicly, in saying that Starlink, which is an internet service that he has made available in Ukraine, which has helped your military communicate on the battlefield, that he will pay for it. This was after some back and forth with the Pentagon about not paying for it. What's the bottom line? Can your military depend on this for communication or not?
Well, look, I have disagreed with Elon Musk on some of his views about Crimea, and we were happy to discuss it with him. But with regard to the company, we have started cooperation with Starlink, excellent cooperation. Before this phase of the war, we got the Starlinks in Ukraine very quickly. In some areas for humanitarian support, it's the only connection that we have, and it's very important to continue having it. And I'm positive that we will find a solution there. And,
so it's not resolved yet?
It's there, it's working. We will need to be working for a longer time. And look, we're proud to be one of the fastest growing Starlink country globally too. But the payment, who's going to pay it, I'm sure we will find the solution there.
Because the Financial Times had reported that there were outages from the satellites that had a direct impact on the battlefield, particularly in the east of the country. Is this payment dispute hurting your military?
Well, look, there is no payment dispute per se. I mean, there are discussions on that we need more and where we need them and how we will need them. But the actual reason for the outages is Russian aggression and the fact that they are bombing our infrastructure and this disrupting the connectivity of all the cellular operators and trying to interfere also with others. Mm-hmm. We're trying to resolve it in many possible ways, and Starlink has been instrumental part of the solution.
France's president drew a lot of scrutiny this week because he said if Russia carries out a nuclear attack on your country, that his country would not respond with nuclear weapons. What exactly is the level of risk right now from the nuclear threat, whether it's from tactical weapons on the battlefield or what's happening at your nuclear power plant?
We cannot rule out anything, and as you said, the nuclear threat is already there because Russians illegally control one of the largest nuclear plants in Europe. And the situation there deteriorates as it's not returned to Ukraine because it's the personnel there is not in the quantity that needs to be there. They are threatened by Russians. We don't know exactly what happens to them. And the station has to be returned to Ukraine in order to decrease the risk. So this is a big risk. And we need Russia to get out. With regard to the use of nuclear weapons, I think, again, its issue is much bigger than Ukraine. We in Ukraine will resist and we will not give up regardless of what Russian Federation is using against us. We have, I think, proven it. From rockets to atrocities to anything that they try to do in Ukraine, it doesn't break our will. So there is no point for Russian Federation to use anything else because it will not stop us in defending our homes. With regard to the global response, it has to be very harsh even for the talks of Russian Federation and Putin about using the nuclear weapons, because this is a clear red line. This is on, on what the whole security infrastructure of Europe and global is built.
So when the French president says something like that, does it muddy that line? Does it blur that line?
Well, I just hope that everyone understands that the way it should be understood. In 1994, Ukraine became the country that voluntarily gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal and received assurances of our safety because we gave up our nuclear weapons. And if a nuclear weapon will be used by a nuclear power, an aggressor, against non-nuclear country like Ukraine, then the whole nuclear deterrence system is going to be under risk. So I think we all together cannot allow Russian Federation to use it.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your time. Always good to have you with us. We'll be back in a moment. We turn now to our political panel. Rachel Bade of Politico is here with us, and Karun Demirjian of The Washington Post. They're the authors of Unchecked, the untold story behind Congress's botched impeachments of Donald Trump. Good morning to you, ladies.
Good morning.
So this is a pretty in-depth autopsy, as you can see by the size here, of what you lay out as strategic missteps, in many ways by Democrats themselves in their attempt to hold the former president accountable. The impeachment work, Senate didn't convict. It feels like it's full of these moments where history could have gone in a different direction. And you lay that all out here. Why do you think it's important to do that?
Yeah, so there's this prevailing wisdom. There's sort of two things we're going to be challenging here in this book and our reporting. The first one is that Trump's acquittals, both of them were inevitable. We find, as you mentioned, a whole bunch of pivotal moments where things could have gone the other way. Moderate Republicans who behind the scenes were freaking out about Trump's behavior and came so close to voting either to impeach or convict, but for certain things that Democrats had done that alienated them, or times when Democrats put pressure on their own investigators not to do a full investigation to try to make the strongest case possible to the public that Trump was dangerous. And so we challenge that. The second sort of preconceived notion we challenge is that, there's this sort of sentiment out there that Republicans just sort of turned a blind eye to everything Trump did, and that's why he got away with everything while Democrats were doing the best they can to make the strongest case publicly. But again, we find a lot of examples where Democrats were putting their political concerns over strategic fact-finding to just try to lay out the case. And privately, they have told us that they did half-baked impeachment and that they didn't make the strongest case possible, and some of them have regrets.
And Karun, I mean, in some ways, the January 6th committee is a continuation of this case. Do you think that it addressed some of these mistakes as you were laying out?
I think that the work that January 6th committee has done in pulling in Republican witnesses, in making sure they fight their subpoenas all the way through the courts, is by itself a recognition that they pulled some punches when they were actually going after Trump during the first two impeachments and the first two impeachment trials. We are seeing the corrective action, basically, taking place in the way and the procedures in which they've gone forward with the January 6th committee's investigation, which is going over a lot of similar ground as at least the second impeachment and trial did. And so that is almost a tacit acknowledgement of, we had the opportunity to take these steps almost 2 years ago, and we chose not to take them. And I think in this book, we look at those intra-party fights, basically, that stopped those steps from happening. These moments where, but for a couple more hours sometimes, but for, a person's sense of confidence versus their fear of being able to, actually use the congressional, constitutional heft of the power that they had to check a president, things may have been able to go a different way. And so, yes, it's clearly a case where there were opportunities for them to go after witnesses, to run down subpoenas that they didn't take in the past, that they are trying to correct in the present. But Trump's not in office anymore,
and you can't have the same
result.
From the very top, from Speaker Pelosi.
That's right. That's right. We have reporting in the book that on January 6th, Pelosi herself shut down an effort by some of her members to try to impeach Trump that very night. And, there was McCarthy was furious. Republicans were just as upset as Democrats that night. I mean, what would have happened if they had just done that, put it on the floor? We'll never know, of course. That's a great question, but it was not just Pelosi, right? It was Chuck Schumer and his staff who we learned through our reporting would put sort of pressure on Jamie Raskin's impeachment team to do a quick trial, to not summon and call and test in court in their subpoenas to go after people like Mike Pence's aides, which now the January 6th committee is doing that. But back then, they just wanted the investigation to move quickly, the trial to be over with, to sort of save Biden's presidency from this messy business of impeachment.
I want to, because what you referenced there reminds me of what we just heard of this past week from the committee with this video the public at least had never seen before. I want to play some of it here in a minute. And just for our viewers, this is where congressional leaders had been evacuated to a safe place out in Virginia during the attack. And you'll hear Speaker Pelosi and the Senate Majority Leader talking to the Attorney General at the time, acting one, Jeffrey Rosen. And you'll see that Republicans are standing there alongside the Democrats at one point.
They're breaking the law in many different ways. And quite frankly, much of it at the instigation of the President of the United States. And now, if he could at least somebody.
Yeah, why don't you get the President to tell them to leave the Capitol, Mr. Attorney General, in your law enforcement responsibility? A public statement, they should all leave. This cannot be just we're waiting for so-and-so. We need them there now, whoever you got. How soon in the future can you have the place evacuated, pulled, cleaned out?
I don't want to speak for the leadership that's going to be responsible for executing the operation, so I'm not going to say that because they're on the ground and they're the experts.
Well, just pretend for a moment it was the Pentagon or the White House or some other entity that was under siege. And let me say, you can logistically get people there as you make the plan.
And ultimately, we hear later from the Vice President, Mike Pence, speaking to Speaker Pelosi, authorizes the movement to eventually happen. But Karen, you see Republican leaders there gathered with Democrats in this moment. How is it that there was no quick action?
Well, as our reporting shows in a piece that actually, an excerpt that ran in The Atlantic this morning, the Republicans were there, crossed the hall to meet with the Democrats. We're in this moment, in this mindset, where they were basically saying, we're done with the White House. We've got to work together here to make this happen. You had people working the phones on both sides of the aisle. McConnell was doing the exact same thing as the Democrats, trying to get people to move towards the Capitol. It's surprising that even with all of that effort, it did still take hours for that help to arrive. But it shows you that this was a moment where kind of everybody was working together to achieve the same ends, which is striking in itself, given how quickly that coalition splintered shortly thereafter. Rachel referenced a moment ago that there was this moment, our reporting showed this moment the night of January 6th, where after they left that terrible crisis hours, they're back on the floor of in the Capitol trying to conclude the Electoral College results. And rank and file Democrats approached the leaders with an impeachment resolution saying, let's do this now. Let's capitalize on that anger. Let's capitalize on this galvanized sense of that we're all in this together and the party lines don't matter. And Pelosi decides not to go for it in that moment. She talks at another point in that video about being ready to throw a physical punch at President Trump, but she pulled the constitutional punch they could have potentially leveled in that moment on that day.
Yeah, I think the most striking thing about Fort McNair and what was happening was that it was really the first time in Trump's, 4 years of Trump's presidency that you saw congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle sort of come together to try to bring Trump to heel. I mean, McConnell, before he went over to the Democrats' room, and by the way, we have this bizarre color in the book about how, for some reason, Republicans and Democrats were escorted to different rooms at Fort McNair despite this emergency. And they're each trying to get through to the Pentagon. They're each trying to figure out why is the National Guard not moving. And McConnell, at one point, his staff is trying to get him on the phone with top defense leaders. They're put on hold, and people are like, Republicans were furious. Why is he putting on hold? So, he crosses the room. And again, he goes and finds Pelosi and Schumer and says, we've got to work together. Together, they were not able to get answers from the Pentagon about why things were taking so fast. And so they all agree that the only person they can really turn to right now is not Trump, it's Mike Pence. And so they call him, and that's where we have this sort of clear the Capitol order. Yeah. It's sort of the backstory of how Pence got to that moment. It was because Hill leaders together were pleading with him to do something.
And it's a powerful read, it's a powerful moment, and ultimately it raises even more questions. Yeah. About their path we're on. Ladies, congratulations on the book. We'll leave it there and be right back. We want to take a closer look now at the Georgia Senate race, one of those key races that could decide which party controls the Senate. Nicole Killion reports from Athens.
Saturdays in the South are meant for college football. But it was Friday's debate featuring University of Georgia legend Herschel Walker that was the talk of the tailgate.
It kind of reaffirmed what I already thought, that Herschel Walker is not fit for office.
In what way?
Doesn't know policy, has clearly fabricated parts of his life.
Herschel Walker has a good heart, and we believe in, a lot of similar things.
In what might have been their only face-to-face debate Friday night, the GOP challenger and Democratic incumbent Senator Raphael Warnock made their cases to Georgia voters.
This race is about who's ready to represent Georgia.
He's for Joe Biden, I'm for Georgia.
Dogged by recent reports that he allegedly paid for a woman's abortion, Walker issued another denial.
That's a lie.
My opponent has a problem with the truth.
But on abortion rights, he appeared to soften his stance, backing off a total ban.
I support the Georgia heartbeat bill because that's the bill of the people from Governor Kemp. And I said that has exceptions in it.
Walker repeatedly tied Warnock to President Biden.
Can you tell me why he voted with Joe Biden 96% of the time if he was standing for Georgia?
When asked about their respective standard bearers in 2024, Walker eagerly endorsed former President Trump, but Warnock was non-committal.
Would you support President Biden running for a second term in 2024?
I've not spent a minute thinking about what politicians should run for what in 2024.
But it was this exchange that went viral as the candidates clashed over law enforcement and Walker's claims of being a police officer.
I've never pretended to be a police officer, and I've never threatened a shootout with the police.
I am with many police officers.
You have a prop.
Yes.
That is not allowed, sir.
A Walker aide tells CBS News that was an honorary badge from a local department, but in a sign of just how critical the stakes are here, former President Obama is set to campaign in Georgia later this month, one of many stops he'll make before the midterms. No word if President Biden or former President Trump will also come down here. Margaret?
Nicole, we will be watching. Thank you. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.